So there is a standard single-family home down in Pinellas County, Florida, that is currently suspended 24 feet in the air.
24 feet. That is, wow, that's more than 2 stories high.
Yeah, literally hovering. The homeowners, they watched the devastating storm surge from Hurricanes Helene and Milton back in 2024, and I guess they just decided they were done taking their chances with the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. I mean, who could blame them after back-to-back hits like that?
Exactly. So they paid $575,000 to just hoist their entire property into the sky. And, they effectively doubled their square footage by building a whole new structure underneath, completely removing their actual living space from the flood zone.
Well, it's a massive physical undertaking, but it's becoming so common. The frequency and the intensity of these recent storm surges, they're really pushing coastal residents to look past just, temporary barriers like sandbags. Elevating the entire structure is rapidly becoming the most logical adaptation if you're sitting at or below the base flood elevation.
Welcome to Meteorology Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the science, chaos, and stories behind the weather that shapes our world. This show was created by meteorologist Rob Jones.
We're glad you're here with us.
Today's deep dive is exploring the architectural, financial, and really the physical reality of elevating homes to adapt to extreme weather. We're going to walk you through the literal nuts and bolts of house lifting, the new state programs that are trying to foot the bill, and the deeply counterintuitive engineering of ground floors that are actually intentionally built to break apart.
Yeah, we are seeing a fundamental shift in coastal resilience right now. The conversation has completely moved from merely, hardening roofs and windows against wind to physically altering a neighborhood's relationship with sea level.
Right. But the shock value of a house hovering 24 feet in the air is one thing. The reality of how that lift physically happens is something we really need to unpack, because I look at this process and the closest analogy I can find is open heart surgery.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. How do you mean?
Well, think about a bypass operation. A machine has to take over the work of pumping blood so the surgeons can safely stop the heart. Right. With a house lift, the foundation is the heart of the building.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Yeah, so given the sheer weight and the fragility of like a wood frame or a concrete blockhouse, how on earth do you remove its foundation without the whole structure just simply snapping in half?
That paralleling to a bypass machine is actually a great way to frame it. The construction crews, they have to build a temporary support system that completely takes over the job of the foundation before they can even think about lifting the place.
So they're building a whole secondary skeleton, basically.
Essentially, yes. They start by inserting this massive cradle of steel I-beams directly underneath, or sometimes literally straight through the home's existing substructure. They will cut holes right into the foundation walls, slide these heavy steel beams below the floor joists, and construct a rigid, load-bearing grid.
Wow, just cutting right through the block.
Right. And that steel skeleton supports the entire weight of the house evenly. And only then do they bring in a network of synchronized hydraulic jacks to raise those beams.
The synchronization there must be absolutely critical. I mean, if one side goes up an inch faster than the other, what happens? The drywall cracks, the framing torques.
The windows would shatter, the doors would jam. Yeah, it would be a disaster.
So exactly how slow is this lifting process?
It is painstakingly slow. It's measured in inches per hour. The hydraulic system pushes the entire footprint of the house simultaneously, and once the house reaches the desired elevation, they stop.
And it just sits there on the jacks.
Right. It sits elevated while the crews build the new permanent foundation underneath. So that's usually reinforced masonry piers, concrete columns, or extended stem walls. Then the jacks slowly lower the house back down onto its new legs. They pull the steel beams out, and the structure is secured.
I have to imagine the complexity of the surgery depends really heavily on the existing anatomy of the house. Like, if you are starting with a crawl space, you already have a gap to slide those beams under the floor joists.
Right. A crawl space makes the initial phase much easier.
But a massive percentage of Coquitlam, Florida homes are built directly on solid concrete slabs. There is no crawl space.
And that is a formidable engineering hurdle. I mean, a concrete slab is a single, rigid, very heavy plane. You cannot just pry it up from the edges, or it'll snap under its own weight.
Right, it would just crumble. So what do?
The crews actually have to dig tunnels, literally hand-digging trenches through the dirt and sand underneath the concrete slab itself.
Wait, they tunnel under the living room?
Under the living room, under the kitchen. They excavate these narrow, reinforced trenches below the slab, thread those temporary steel lifting beams through the tunnels, and then they lift the entire concrete slab completely intact. The entire house is just carried up on top of it.
Tunneling through loose Florida sand under the weight of a concrete slab sounds incredibly precarious. Not to mention, it sounds like something that takes a tremendous amount of time.
Oh, it does. The time frame for a full elevation project, from the initial engineering and the permitting, all the way to the final lowering and hooking up the plumbing and utilities, that runs between 10 to 12 months.
Almost a year of construction.
Yeah. And the financial weight matches the physical weight here. Depending on the size of the home, the foundation type, and any structural upgrades you need, the total out-of-pocket cost ranges from $200,000 to upward of $2 million.
$2 million. Wow. Well, we can look at a very specific baseline just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
There's a company called JAS Builders, and they're managing nearly 100 of these elevation projects right now, mostly in Pinellas, Citrus, and Manatee counties.
Okay, so they have a lot of data on this.
A ton of data. And they cited a relatively straightforward rental property in Shore Acres. Elevating that house cost about $250,000.
So $250,000 just to get the floor joists out of the floodwater.
Just for the lift.
Yeah.
Which forces a very difficult calculation for these property owners after a major hurricane hits. Do you tear down the damaged structure and start over, or do you repair and lift what you have?
That's the million-dollar question. Or I guess the $250,000 question.
Right. Let's look at how Milt and Janet, a couple living on Sanibel Island, handled that calculation after Hurricane Ian devastated their ground-level home. They found themselves facing a massive rebuild cost of over $500 per square foot.
Oh, man. $500 a square foot is staggering.
Yeah, tearing down and building a completely new elevated home from scratch at that price was just financially impossible for them.
And that's where the economics heavily favor preserving the existing structure. Lifting becomes the primary mechanism for salvaging the equity they already have tied up in the framing and the roof.
But the interesting thing is, they didn't just aim for the minimum requirement. A 5-foot lift would have satisfied the local FEMA compliance standards for their specific flood zone. Instead, they opted to go up 10 feet.
10 feet, so they doubled the requirement.
Yeah, they did. Pushing past the minimum gave them peace of mind, sure, but it also fundamentally changed the utility of their property. Going up 10 feet allowed them to elevate their garage right along with the house.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, they converted that massive lower volume into usable enclosed living space. So Milt's perspective was that the initial sticker shock of the lift, the $250,000, was offset by the immense property value they added by creating that new square footage.
Gaining usable real estate while securing the structure against storm surge is a very strategic way to approach the capital investment. However, a $250,000 or a $500,000 invoice, that is an insurmountable barrier to entry for the average coastal resident.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
Who has that kind of cash on hand?
Almost no one. Most people simply do not have the liquidity to self-fund a 10-month civil engineering project on their primary residence.
Which brings us to the real friction point between the need for climate resilience and the reality of government bureaucracy. If lifting is literally the only way to save these neighborhoods, how does the average household afford it?
Well, the state government recognized this massive gap and launched a program called Elevate Florida.
Right, the Elevate Florida program. Let's dig into that.
So it's managed by the Florida Division of Emergency Management, and it is a residential mitigation program designed specifically to shoulder the bulk of the construction costs associated with hardening these homes against future storms.
And the financial structure of the program is built around a really heavy subsidy. The grant covers up to 75% of the project's eligible costs.
Which is huge.
It is. The homeowner is then just responsible for the remaining 25% cost share. So doing the math, for a $300,000 lift, the state covers $225,000, leaving the homeowner to find $75,000.
Which is still a lot of money, but much more manageable.
Right, and they can cover that gap using personal savings or loans from the Small Business Administration, or by tapping into something called increased cost of compliance funds.
Yeah, the increased cost of compliance, or ICC, is actually a really critical piece of the funding puzzle for a lot of applicants. It's a specific coverage rider built into most standard national flood insurance program policies.
So it's part of their existing flood insurance.
Exactly. If your home is substantially damaged by a flood, ICC provides up to $30,000 to help cover the cost of mitigating the structure to meet local floodplain management laws.
Okay, so that knocks out Almost half of their $75,000 responsibility right there.
It does. And the demand for that puzzle to be solved is just massive. Between February and April of 2025 alone, the Elevate Florida program received more than 12,000 applications.
12,000. Just in 2 months.
Yeah, from residents spanning 64 different counties. And they are not all just asking for hydraulic lifts either. The program actually offers 4 distinct project pathways.
Okay, so the first one is structure elevation, which is the lifting process we just detailed. What are the others?
The second is mitigation reconstruction. This comes into play when the structural integrity of the existing home is just too compromised to survive the lifting process. Like the house would fall apart if they put it on jacks.
Got it. So they just bulldoze it.
Basically, the house is demolished and a completely new, code-compliant, elevated building is constructed on the original footprint.
And the third option is wind mitigation, right? Which focuses entirely on hardening the structure to resist hurricane-force winds. So upgrading roofs, putting in impact windows, reinforced doors.
Right, keeping the wind out. And the fourth pathway is acquisition and demolition, which is essentially a voluntary buyout. The state purchases the property, demolishes the structure, and then the local community takes over that land to maintain it as open, unbuildable space in perpetuity.
Just letting nature take it back.
Exactly. But the logistics of managing those 4 pathways across 12,000 properties are incredibly complex. You have application reviews, environmental impact studies, historic preservation checks, and you have to assign vetted construction vendors to every single project.
That sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
It is a very long line to wait in. The state actually anticipates that final closeouts for this wave of applications will last well into 2027 and beyond. Furthermore, the underlying economics of construction are highly volatile right now.
Oh, because of inflation and supply chain issues.
Yes, and labor shortages post-storm. By September 2025, the program actually had to increase the federal funding cap for the hard costs on mitigation reconstruction projects. The cap jumped from $220,000 to $375,000.
Wow. A $155,000 increase just to keep pace with the soaring cost of labor and materials.
Yeah.
I mean, and the state is clearly trying to make the math work, but I really want to scrutinize the reality of this program on the ground for you.
Let's do it.
We have a government initiative offering to pay for 3/4 of a home elevation. On paper, that sounds like a total lifeline. But the statistics out of Sanibel Island tell a very different story. Listen to this. Out of 230 applications submitted by Sanibel residents for these various mitigation projects, 226 were withdrawn.
226 out of 230.
Yeah. Only 2 were approved, and 2 remained under review. So why on earth would hundreds of homeowners just walk away from hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money?
Well, that withdrawal rate really highlights the severe friction between a person's risk tolerance and these bureaucratic timelines. Now, some of those withdrawals were mandatory.
Mandatory. How so?
If an applicant had already secured, say, a small business administration loan or other federal funding for the exact same repairs, accepting the Elevate Florida grant would constitute a duplication of benefits, which is strictly prohibited.
Oh, I see. You can't double dip.
Right. But a significant portion of those withdrawals were proactive choices by the homeowners themselves.
Because living in a damaged ground-level house while waiting for a committee review is a terrifying prospect during hurricane season.
Precisely. In June 2025, the federal requirements governing these grants became even more stringent. They added additional review steps before funding could be released, and that just extended the projected timelines nationwide. The residents simply ran out of time.
Yeah, we saw this with a Sanibel resident named Lasky, who officially withdrew their application. Lasky noted that the bureaucratic line was simply too long, and the threat of the next storm was just too immediate.
You can't put a hurricane on hold while you wait for a permit.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
So they chose to bypass the state assistance entirely and just self-fund the elevation. For them, the security of having the house 10 feet in the air before the next system entered the Gulf of Mexico completely outweighed the financial benefit of a delayed grant.
The vulnerability of waiting is a cost in itself. So let's assume the timeline is managed right. A homeowner navigates the grant process, or they self-fund the project. The hydraulic jacks do their work, and the house is now successfully resting on new concrete columns.
Okay. The house is up in the air.
Yes. The homeowner is now looking at a massive, empty volume of space underneath their living room. And the immediate instinct for most people would be to break up those columns and create a solid, secure basement or maybe a massive enclosed garage.
Which makes sense. You want to use that space, but you can't just build a regular concrete bunker under there, right?
Yeah. No, the engineering codes explicitly forbid that. FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program maintain really strict regulations for properties located in what they define as coastal high hazard areas.
Commonly referred to as Zone V.
Yes, Zone V. The empty space beneath an elevated home in these zones cannot be permanently enclosed by rigid, load-bearing walls. The regulations restrict the enclosure materials to open lattice work, insect screening, or something known in the building code as breakaway walls.
And the term breakaway wall, I have to admit, it sounds like a massive contradiction in structural engineering. I mean, we spend our lives building walls to be as strong as possible.
Right. But a breakaway wall is specifically designed to fail.
Intentionally designing a wall to fail. The prescriptive design method dictates that these walls must safely collapse when they're subjected to lateral forces between 10 and 20 pounds per square foot.
It is deeply counterintuitive until you look at the physics of storm surge. See, standing water creates hydrostatic pressure, which is very heavy, but it's relatively static.
It just sits there pushing against things.
Yeah, exactly. But a storm surge driven by a hurricane creates hydrodynamic force. Moving water carries an immense amount of kinetic energy. If you enclose the ground floor of an elevated house with a rigid concrete wall, that wall acts like a giant sail catching all that water.
And the water has nowhere to go. So all of that kinetic energy slams into the rigid wall, and I'm guessing it transfers directly into the primary foundation columns that are supporting the house.
Yes. The lateral force of a moving surge is easily strong enough to shear concrete columns in half or just rip them entirely out of the earth. So the rigid lower wall would drag the entire elevated structure down into the floodwaters with it.
Oh, wow. Taking the whole house down.
Yeah, so a breakaway wall solves this by acting as a controlled failure point. When the hydrodynamic pressure hits that 10 to 20 pounds per square foot threshold, the fasteners connecting the wall to the foundation shear off. The wall panels detach, they wash away, and that allows the floodwaters to pass cleanly right through the structural columns.
So sacrificing the ground floor enclosure is what saves the primary residence above. It is the exact same engineering philosophy used in automotive crumple zones. A car manufacturer intentionally designs the front end of a vehicle to buckle and compress during an impact, right? The front end destroys itself to absorb the kinetic energy so the passenger cabin remains completely intact.
That's a perfect analogy.
Here, the engineers are designing the ground floor to literally blow out so the living room stays in the sky. But this raises a very practical question for the homeowner. If the threshold is only 10 pounds per square foot, does that mean every time a moderate thunderstorm rolls off the Gulf of Mexico, the bottom of the house safely explodes into the front yard?
Well, no. The baseline prescriptive limit is intentionally low to guarantee failure under flood conditions, but the building code does provide engineering exemptions to handle higher wind loads. Using something called the simplified design method, a registered professional engineer can certify a breakaway wall to withstand lateral pressures up to 55 pounds per square foot.
Okay, so that gives the wall enough structural integrity to survive the high winds of a severe squall or even a lower category hurricane, while still guaranteeing it will collapse before the heavy water pressure actually threatens the foundation.
Right, but the engineer has to certify two very specific conditions. First, the breakaway wall must detach before the base flood conditions exert enough force to damage the main foundation. And second, the detachment of that wall cannot cause any collateral damage to the elevated building above as it washes away.
So it requires a very precise calculation of fastener shear strength versus wind and water loading.
Very precise. It's a delicate balance.
While I was looking through the technical bulletins on this, I found a brilliant loophole in the design applications. Did you know that standard residential garage doors often naturally qualify as breakaway panels?
Really? Just regular garage doors?
Yeah. Even though they are not explicitly tested in wave tanks for hydrodynamic failure, the published wind loading capacities of standard garage doors tend to max out right around that 55 pounds per square foot limit.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. They buckle and fail under heavy pressure by their very nature. It provides such an elegant architectural solution for the homeowner.
It really does, because the space below the base flood elevation is restricted to parking, building access, or limited storage anyway. Installing a standard garage door secures that space from theft and weather on a normal Tuesday, completing the visual aesthetic of the home.
But when the storm surge arrives, the garage door panels buckle, the water flows straight through the structure, the pressure is released, and the house standing above remains completely untouched.
Which leaves us with a much broader reality to consider for you as we watch these adaptation strategies roll out. Thousands of homes along the Gulf and the Atlantic coast are being elevated 10, 15, or 24 feet in the air.
The scale of this is unprecedented.
It is. This is not just a matter of altering individual flood insurance premiums anymore. We are actively reshaping the skyline and the culture of the American coast.
The architectural language of coastal living is undergoing a profound transition. I mean, the traditional ground-level bungalow is just being phased out in favor of elevated fortresses. Neighborhoods are quite literally transforming into cities on stilts.
And it alters how a community interacts on a daily basis. The culture of chatting with a neighbor over a low backyard fence, or waving from a front porch that changes entirely when the neighborhood is staggered at varying elevations and residents are looking down at the street from a third-story vantage point.
Yeah, carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs changes your daily routine. The climate is forcing our hands on the engineering, but the engineering is fundamentally reshaping the fabric of the neighborhoods themselves.
It really is. If you want to keep exploring how weather impacts our daily lives, our architecture, and our future, make sure you follow Rob Jones. You can find him sharing incredible weather insights and visuals on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and Bluesky. And if you found value in today's discussion, please take a moment to like, follow, comment, and rate the show. It is the absolute best way to help this podcast reach more curious minds.
We really appreciate the support.
You've been listening to Meteorology Matters, created by meteorologist Rob Jones. Thanks for listening, and remember, meteorology always matters.